What should an anti-natalist do when someone is about to be responsible for the suffering and eventual death of an innocent being? In other words, what should we do when someone is planning to conceive? There are mainly two competing interests here. One is the right/freedom of reproductive choice, and the other is the prevention of suffering and death of an innocent being. In an ethical, free society, both interests should be considered, but the fact is these two considerations can conflict with each other to the point of being mutually exclusive. Exercising one's freedom to create someone will lead to the created being's suffering and death, because these are inherent in all sentient life. So the freedom of one person leads to the death of another. How, then, does a potential parent justify this apparent contradiction in ethical behavior? Most don't think about this as a contradiction at all. Somehow, the perceived temporal distance of death makes it almost an abstract concept, or more likely, not even a consideration. They think about the new person being raised and brought to adulthood and the relationship with this new person that comes with this process, but the person's eventual death and interim suffering doesn't usually come to mind for the potential parent. Why? Is it denial, ignorance, delusion, or perhaps even acceptance and dismissal of importance? I would bet hardly any human decisions are purely irrational, and this decision is no exception. With a combination of biology, societal influences, and predisposition toward or away from empathy, most people's final decision on this matter has more weight on the reproduction side than the avoidance of procreation. The deck is stacked against anti-natalism, no matter how rational and ethical it may be. But it does not need to stay this way. There are many people in the world who don't feel strongly about having kids one way or another. This group of people are the ones who are more likely to be influenced by consistent, normalizing, and compassionate proposals put forth by anti-natalism. No decision is made in a vacuum, which means persuasion goes beyond arguments. Even though the argument alone should ideally be considered, the source of an argument matters to a lot of people. Your close friend telling you to quit smoking tends to have more weight than a stranger, to whom you have no emotional connection, telling you the same thing. If we feel the person telling us something cares about us, we are much more likely to listen to his or her message. This is not a new revelation, but we often forget it when we're trying to convince someone of a position. So even though I wish the arguments for anti-natalism alone should be enough to convince people of its moral value, they probably won't. Instead, the likely slow process of caringly building connections with those on the fence about reproduction is more likely to have success. But this is especially hard for a topic that is often polarizing from the start and is still so taboo. This is where normalization becomes important. An opinion or position becomes normalized when a sufficiently large number of people adopt the position publicly, or the minority who holds the position is not seen as threatening by the majority of people. Arguably, some examples in this category are vegetarianism, homosexuality, and moderate minority religions, to name a few. The acceptance of these obviously varies by society, but there are societies where all of these are considered normalized, non-threatening, and able to peacefully coexist with the rest of that society. So I think the challenge for anti-natalism is not so much to propose increasingly more clever arguments, although these are still valuable, but rather to work toward becoming mainstream. There have been interesting psychological experiments where people's trust in another person can come simply from that other person being present in the same space as them. For example, if you go to a certain grocery store every week and the same person, who is of no threat to you, is also present there, as a customer or employee, for example, that person is slightly more likely to be trustworthy to you. even if you have not communicated with him or her at all. In other words, repeated exposure to a non-threatening stimulus normalizes the stimulus. With respect to antinatalism, this means the non-threatening presence of antinatalists in everyday life will make it more likely for our precision to be seen as a variation of normal, which will then make it more likely for those sitting on the metaphorical reproductive fence to be swayed not to reproduce. Will this convince all of humanity? Of course not. But antinatalism can still make a very significant impact in reducing suffering by convincing the undecided. I'll put forth several possible approaches here. One would be expanding the mention of antinatalist principles. For example, having more media exposure, such as in movies, TV shows, books, music, etc. The more it's out there, the more it's seen as normal. This is a technique marketers have known for ages. Simple repetition. Another one is making it more common to ask why people want to become biological parents. This should not be phrased confrontationally, but rather with open curiosity. Something like, a lot of people nowadays are taking more time to decide whether to have children. I'm curious, how did you arrive at your decision? Often the first step in effecting change is to simply question the status quo and indirectly allowing people to notice the water they are swimming in, so to speak. A lot of people who consider themselves child-free, for example, mention that realizing there was a choice to not have children was a spark that started their thought process. The so-called default does not have to be. Hopefully, with time, the onus of explanation can shift more on those who procreate rather than on those who don't. Along the same lines, giving people permission to think about antinatalism is another step toward normalization. In other words, you can think about antinatalism without being an antinatalist. Just like you can think about vegetarianism without being a vegetarian. This may seem trivial, but that is the nature of taboo subjects. To even think about them is considered socially prohibited. This approach can even start with a silly framing, like, have you heard of this weird philosophy that questions whether reproduction is ethical? I'm not really convinced of what it proposes, but it does make you think about so many interesting things. I've seen this play out in some interviews where the person speaking about antinatalism assures the interviewer he or she is not an antinatalist. But as the conversation unfolds, the rejection of the label doesn't matter because the message is delivered, and a lot of times the interviewee doesn't have children, so pragmatically, that's pretty darn close to what we could hope for. Beyond just making antinatalism an acceptable topic of conversation, there is the issue of credibility. And to stay credible, antinatalism has to stick with its two core principles, in my opinion. Minimizing suffering through the avoidance of creation of new, potentially suffering beings, and respecting autonomy. I'd be the last person to restrict freedom of speech, but we have to consider the damaging effect, unfairly or not, that associations of unethical behavior can have on antinatalism, as viewed by society at large. A bit like a minority group may have to work harder to avoid negative press in an oppressive society, antinatalists have to make sure to be ethical citizens who contribute to their community and are nice to others. The fewer pretexts we give to society to paint us as threatening, the better. It may not be fair for the bar to be higher for us, but as antinatalists, our eyes are already very much open to the unfairness of the world, and all in all, it's not a bad thing for us to try to be good people. There's no doubt that what I'm proposing is an uphill battle. And here we can learn a thing or two from religion. How do religions make it seem normal to believe something that, to an outside observer, can seem bizarre at first? Social cohesion. I would argue that a lot of religions are ultimately not really about the specific beliefs, but rather about a group of people that find comfort in each other and in a vague notion of a greater power that ultimately compels those involved to act in a way that reinforces the comfort found in the group. For example, most religious people are not scriptural scholars, deeply knowledgeable about the historical and theological origins of their religion. Instead, they accept a general version of good enough for me in their minds, and the rest of their day-to-day practice is driven by the biological urge to belong. What does this have to do with antinatalism, a philosophy that prides itself on rational thought and careful ethical consideration? Well, at the end of the day, we are still animals, biologically. By keeping in mind our shared predicament as human beings, we can bring forth the importance of caring about each other, both born and unborn. We can create that social cohesion by comforting each other, knowing that though suffering and death will happen, we help each other alleviate pain and distress, which is tremendously valuable. These principles matter because we are people who care for and about each other. I think that's worth normalizing. Thanks for listening.